All right. I think that we still have a few people rolling in, but now that it is about 12:05 on the East Coast time in the US, I think that we're going to get started. But hello to everyone today and welcome to our session on restorative justice in our schools, building sustainable community-based solutions to conflict and harm. My name is Laura Osterndorf. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the training manager for the Speak Truth to Power team of Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights, as well as one of the organizers of this workshop series.
Hello, everyone. My name is Monica Smith. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a policy attorney with RFK Human Rights, U.S. Advocacy and Litigation team. Our work is focused on ending pretrial and immigration detention. Our team includes attorneys, community activists, entrepreneurs, and educators united by Robert F. Kennedy's vision, where all societies, groups, and states exist to make a better and more equitable life for all peoples. We are mindful in our pursuit of equal justice and fight for racial equity, aiming to reduce mass criminalization and incarceration and empower youth and communities with the skills needed to organize and create social change.
And through our Speak Truth to Power human rights education program, we make sure that human rights are central to the learning experience. And part of this is integrating restorative justice practices into formal and non-formal learning environments so that we develop a citizenry who is prepared to prevent and respond to conflict and harm.
For that reason and many others, we are thrilled to introduce our partners and facilitators for today's session, Cymone Fuller and Sia Henry, co-director and senior program specialist of the Restorative Justice Project at Impact Justice.
We are honored to share this space with them and with this global community of human rights educators so that we can all work together to build environments of community healing, safety, and well-being. So without further ado, I would like to pass it to Cymone and Sia.
Thanks so much, Laura. And we're so happy to be here and welcome. And thank you so much to everyone who's tuned in. Again, you can turn on closed captioning if you need to. Apologies in advance that we weren't able to find a sign language interpreter for this session. So before we jump into the actual substance of our presentation today in this session, we wanted to first take a moment to acknowledge and name the original caretakers of the land that Cymone and I are calling in from. So we are both currently in Montgomery County, Maryland, which is just outside of DC, just over the border. And this is the land of the Piscataway people and the Anacostans. So we think it's always important to keep in mind the reality that we're all living and operating on stolen land, assuming you're calling in within the United States. And also, just specifically as restorative justice practitioners, our work is grounded in Indigenous practices and ways of being in community, which we'll get into in a little bit. But we always like to start off by honoring the fact that this isn't something that Cymone and I or our team just came up with. This is actually something that folks from all over the world for centuries have been practicing. And so this is just something that we have taken and we've kind of slapped this modern term of restorative justice onto it. So as we open things up, we know that some folks have already started to introduce themselves, which we really appreciate. And so we just want to invite people to continue to introduce yourselves in the chat. And if possible, let us know who the original caretakers are of the land that you are joining us from. So Cymone and I work for a nonprofit organization called Impact Justice. And we are a national training and innovation center based out of Oakland, California. But Cymone and I work out of our Washington, DC office. And our organization is dedicated to significantly reducing the number of people who enter our country's criminal legal system, improving conditions for people who are currently incarcerated, and then also providing meaningful support to folks who are re-entering their communities after periods of incarceration. And specifically, Cymone and I work for Impact Justice's Restorative Justice Project. So we are working with communities around the country to establish pre-charge restorative justice diversion programs to respond to serious harm. And as you may have guessed, my name is Sia. I use she, her pronouns. I am technically an attorney and I have a background in doing prison and jail conditions of confinement work. And I come to restorative justice with a very deep love for and hope for liberation for communities of color. And I will hand it to Cymone to introduce herself.
Thanks, Sia. And thank you to everyone who took some time out of their day to join us from all over the world. It's so exciting to see so many different people from different places sharing hellos and welcomes in the chat. Like Sia said, I'm Cymone Fuller. I'm the co-director of our Restorative Justice Project, and am so grateful to be in the position to work with our team and with so many communities around the country that are really focused on defining what justice looks like for their communities in a way that centers healing, centers connection, centers the idea that when harm happens, it should stay in the communities in which that harm happened, so that they have the tools to be able to provide all of the healing and wholeness that is necessary for folks to move forward. I come to this work having done a ton of work in partnership with jurisdictions around the US that were focused on making some levels of reform in their criminal legal system and moving towards community-based continuums of care. And I'm so fortunate to now be able to marry my love of restorative justice, which I was first introduced to in Cape Town, South Africa, with the work of trying to move away from the current criminal legal system we know in the US and really invest in the communities that are experiencing high levels of policing and over incarceration, and bring them the tools to be able to practice restorative justice. So happy to be here with all of you. And again, thank you. So much gratitude for you to take the time to join us today.
Thanks, Cymone. So as many of you may know, so this is the first of 3 sessions that we will be leading. Cymone and I will be leading over the course of the next 3 Tuesdays. Next Tuesday and the following Tuesday, we'll have some very special community partners also joining us to help lead those sessions. So we are going to spend next week and the week after talking more specifically about educational spaces and how restorative justice can and may be used in those spaces. But today we're really going to dive deeply into the kind of roots and foundations of restorative justice. And by the end of our time together, by the end of, I believe we have a little under 2 hours at this point together today, we're hoping that you will come to both understand restorative justice, philosophy, and values, and then also be able to draw connections between restorative justice and human rights education. And just so you all know, we'll have time at the end to respond to questions, but feel free to throw questions in the chat as we go. Laura has very graciously agreed to kind of pull all the questions together and keep all those in one place for Cymone and I to respond to at the end. So again, as we go, feel free to throw questions in the chat as they come up for you. Okay, so I know we have a pretty big group, so we're gonna try a little bit of a visioning activity here. And so I would like to invite folks to take 3 deep breaths with us. I know people are calling in from different time zones, different countries. So you may have already had a long day. You may just be starting your day. So we're just going to start off with some deep breathing. And I would also like to invite folks to close your eyes or just lower your gaze if that feels more comfortable for you. And as you continue to take your deep breaths, imagine you've been transported 50 years into the future. And as you walk around, you realize society has been transformed into the perfect or ideal community, whatever that means to you. So as you walk around this ideal community, we want you to think about what you see, right? What can you see in that community? What's there? Who do you see? Who all do you see participating in this ideal community? How do you feel? What's happening? And as you continue to walk around this quote ideal community that you're envisioning 50 years into the future, recognize that you can always come back to this vision. You're always welcome back, as everyone is always welcome there. But for now, I'm gonna very gently, when you're ready, call you back to present day 2021. And just when you're ready and you feel comfortable, you can open your eyes and grab a pen and paper if you have those items nearby. You can always use your computer. And we're gonna take a couple minutes to jot down what you saw and experienced in that vision 50 years into the future. So why don't we take 5 minutes? I will play some music while you all jot down some thoughts, and then call everyone back 21 minutes after the hour, depending on whatever time zone you're in. So again, we're just taking 5 minutes to jot down what you saw. And again, you have some prompts on the screen. So what you saw, who you saw, how you felt, what was happening in that vision we just imagined 50 years in the future, thinking about our ideal community. Take one more minute for folks to jot down what they saw in their ideal communities. All right. So let's all kind of redirect our attention back to the larger group. And if folks are able to either open up a new tab on your computer, or you can even use your phones, I'd like to invite everyone to go to slido.com. The I don't know what it's called, URL is on the PowerPoint, slido.com. And once you go there, you should be able to just enter in the code RFK. And we're asking folks to answer in a few words, answer the questions on the screen. So, again, thinking about that ideal community and the vision of community that you just thought about, and all the ideas that you just jotted down. What is there? Who do you see? How do you feel? And what is happening? And you should be able to submit multiple answers. So just asking folks to keep their answers. Oh no, sorry. Relatively short, because I know we're a big group. So we have a couple answers trickling in. Hopefully everyone can see the screen. So someone said, to live with awareness that humanity is one family. I love that. Ideal vision of community means to me everyone is respected, treated equally, no discrimination, low crime, helpful neighbors, sufficient schools, busing, transportation, access to food and medical services. Everyone is respected, treated equally, no discrimination. Saw many people moving around, interacting with each other, and a feeling of togetherness, happiness prevailing. I want to see an equitable society where everyone has equal rights, so no one feels left out and enjoys. Oh no, that changed. Sorry, these are jumping around. I lost that one. Let's see.
I'm seeing folks also mention things like gardens and trees and nature also in their ideal community. Equal rights.
Jobs that are fulfilling and that provide enough resources. Every person free and equally protected by the law. I see joy, I see rest, I see a world where, oh no. Sorry, y'all. Okay. I see a world similar to June Jordan's vision. I feel restful, I feel fulfilled. I see kids playing, laughing, getting to be kids. I see fire hydrants spraying water. That reminds me of New York. Elders resting in their own joy. Adults that are living in the moment as they live in care. I see hope. Wait for a few more to trickle in. I see myself and my society and the community. I feel there are a lot of humans in need of help and education. Sorry, these are all bouncing around. This is not working out the way I had anticipated. Humanity is one community, brotherhood, people, all age groups, children, youth, adults, peaceful. A just community where there is peace and love, no hierarchy. Everyone gets to be who they are. I love that. We meet our responsibilities to each other. So as we wait for a few more to responses to trickle in. I'm definitely noticing a theme amongst a lot of these responses around, you know, relationships and being in community with everyone, a feeling or a sense that everyone belongs, a feeling of interconnectedness, which we'll kind of get into in a little bit, but this idea of, you know, relationships and everyone kind of doing their part, and carrying out their different responsibilities that they owe to each other. No hierarchies, there's peace, there's love. I love all of these responses. These are beautiful visions. So I am going to move us along a bit. Thank you all so much for participating in this activity. And again, I mean, you know, remember that you were always welcome to revisit that vision 50 years out into the future. And we're going to be spending the next hour and a half or so talking about ways that restorative justice can begin to support you, and that you can begin to kind of lean on a restorative justice framework and practices to begin to build and grow towards this vision that you all have collectively, kind of indirectly, individually, but then also collectively created. So with that, let me take us back. No. Okay. To our slides. All right, and I will hand it to Cymone.
Great, thanks, Sia. So yeah, so much of what has been shared about this vision that we hold for our ideal community really represents a longing for connectedness, a longing for a space where everybody is treated with dignity, with respect, with care, with the resources that they need to be safe and secure and able to kind of live into their full selves. And I really appreciate that that is a theme that is bridging across so many people, different countries, different experiences, different perspectives. So many of us have never met, and yet there are so many themes in what we are collectively working towards as a vision for our community together. So I'm going to move us into hearing from somebody that I'm sure many folks are very familiar with hearing from, and I could listen to him speak time and time again. As I mentioned in my opening, South Africa is where I was first introduced to restorative justice and the notion of truth being so connected to the notion of justice. And so I'm going to ask us to spend a couple of minutes listening to the words of Bishop Desmond Tutu as he talks about a core rooted value system that is really well connected to the roots and the values of restorative justice. So if you could hit play, Sia.
Let me tell you, we have something in our African community, something that is very difficult to put into English. It is called Ubuntu. Ubuntu. Ubuntu is the essence of being human. And it says, a solitary human being is a contradiction in terms. I can't be a human being on my lonesome. I wouldn't know how to speak as a human being. I wouldn't know how to think as a human being. I wouldn't know how to walk as a human being. I have to learn from other human beings how to be human. And so Ubuntu says, my humanity is bound up in yours. I am only because you are. And we then say, a person is a person through other persons. And that we need this communal harmony if we're going to survive at all. And anger and revenge and bitterness are corrosive of this harmony. And you know it, you've experienced how when you are really angry with someone, it does something to your tum-tum. It does something to your blood pressure. So forgiving is actually not being altruistic. You're not being nice to the other guy. When you forgive, you're actually being nice to yourself. Forgiving, apart from anything else, is good for your health.
Thanks, Sia. We can go to the next slide.
Sorry, give me a minute.
So as we're transitioning, no worries, Sia. So much of what Bishop Tutu highlights here is so much of what you all shared as what you're hoping to work towards and how you identify a collective ideal vision of community. And these are rooted in the grounding values and principles of restorative justice. As Bishop Tutu reminds us, Ubuntu and so much of the core of so many cultures and societies around the world are rooted in this value of relationship and interconnectedness. I am because you are, and recognizing that even our own awareness of ourself as a human being comes through relationship with others. It also reminds us that as humans, we have the ability to connect with how we feel with others, right? I thought it was so great when Desmond Tutu listed up the idea that, you feel something when you are angry, right? You can feel it in your blood. You can feel your heart beat faster. You can feel your blood pressure rise. And for so many others, that is a shared feeling. And when you can connect with that, you are able to recognize how you are engaging with others. And that is just part of the core of being human, being able to tap into those things in relation to others and when we are connecting with others. And the other grounding value that I want to invite folks to step into is the awareness of when we recognize our relationships and interconnectedness as core to our being human, we recognize that in order for us to all show up in space, that we have to be working to build space that is about sharing power and not exercising power over people. And so for our team, we talk about this as the power with approach, right? To create a space where the power that one person has is not used over another. Rather, the power that space holds is a shared power that really invites people to step into that space, to share their truths, to share their experiences, to be themselves without fear of judgment, of persecution, of consequence that will bring additional harm to that space. So in a power with approach, the power is shared amongst everybody that comes into that space together. And in part, the goal of doing that is to make sure that there is a benefit to stepping into the collective wisdom of that space. And collective wisdom is the idea that there's no real one expert, right? Some folks might know something that other folks don't know, but to answer the big questions of how we are to be together, we need to be able to pull on what each of us knows. We need to be able to lean into the truth that each of us lives and have space to bring that forward and together. And I think another thing to lift up here is that the one thing that we all know better than anyone else is what we are experiencing, right? So being able to make sure that everybody is able to speak to what they are experiencing, to come forward with collective wisdom, is part of the value of restorative justice. It's the space that allows for that collective wisdom to come together. And through all of these values, right, there is this core principle of dignity, and the idea that dignity for all people is something that we want to hold as sacred and make sure that we sustain in all of our engagements together. And in order to make right and bring whole and restore, we have to recognize that dignity. So, for example, for us, one of the ways that we practice the dignity of all is in the language that we choose to use. And so there's oftentimes words like offender and victim that are connected to conversations about restorative justice and when we think about harm. But for us, that language of offender, of victim, really puts people in a place of a moment in time, of a circumstance that is very fixed. For somebody to be an offender means that that becomes their identity, and there's really no room that's provided in that language for them to move into more than that, to be more of themselves, to honor the wholeness of a person. Same thing with victim, to put them in a moment in time where they felt like a victim doesn't allow for them to see beyond the moment where they get to see all the other parts of themselves and the power of moving forward. And so because of that, we use words like the person harmed or the person who caused harm. In our programs, we call young people who have caused harm the responsible youth. And survivors, right? Because that language allows for people to grow. It reminds people that even when the harm is removed, there are still people there, and that people have so much more to them than just the one experience that they might be coming to restorative justice for. And so a harmed person, once that harm is healed, is still a person. And so making sure that the language that we use reflects the dignity of all people and that they are more than just a moment of their lives. Next slide, please. Thanks, Sia. And all of this, right, is core to restorative justice, but it's also so core to our understanding of humanity and the rights that we have as human. The quote on the side you see here, "I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of reality." Dr. King, who has led one of the most powerful movements for civil and human rights that many of us think of, also lived into these values and recognition that the place that we need to start is an awareness that we have a stake in what others go through. We have a stake in the other, and that really the other is us, and that collectively we have to be concerned about the idea that we are creating structures in society that don't let people become who they are and who they ought to be. And in that, we are never allowing ourselves to be what we ought to be and who we can truly be. And so I think that's a perfect segue to pass off to Laura to share a little bit about why we even came together and where we saw such a strong overlap between restorative justice and understandings of human rights and human rights education. So I'm going to go ahead and pass to you, Laura.
Thank you so much, Cymone. And I think that if we understand that at its core, restorative justice is rooted in the fundamental belief that we have interconnectedness and shared humanity, it's pretty clear to see the ways that restorative justice and the notions of human rights go hand in hand. Because human rights are the rights a person has simply because they're a human being. And in other words, to violate someone's human rights is to treat that person as though they're not even human. And human rights are also those basic standards that allow us as all people to live in dignity and respect. And they're guaranteed to all of us, no matter our race, gender, language, religion, or other status. And these principles are going to hold up the vision of a free, just, and peaceful world and set the minimum standards for how individuals and institutions everywhere should treat people. So to achieve this socially just world built on human rights, we need to engage with human rights education and restorative justice so that we develop youth and adults who value the human rights of all members of their community and approach conflict with deep empathy, relationship building, and those social emotional skills that are going to improve your community well-being and provide peaceful and sustainable solutions to conflict, harm, and human rights abuses everywhere. I'll pass it back to you, Cymone.
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, so just so much overlay and interconnectedness, even in our understanding of restorative justice and how that relates to the core belief that there are rights that all humans deserve just because they're human. And I also want to make note and be very clear that I recognize that even this vision of community and ideal community and the idea that folks actually are honored in their own human rights and that those human rights are extended to all of us feels distant. It feels far away. For many of us, it doesn't resonate with our current experience of the world, of our daily lives, of what we watch on the news. It does feel separate from where we are today. And I wanted to take some time to talk about why that is. You know, it's interesting because oppression, as the Oxford Dictionary defines oppression, is the state of being subject to unjust treatment or control. However, in our US justice system, we find practices of oppression at every turn. So some of the core features of oppression are the practice of disconnecting from your source, the source being your history, your culture, your source of your humanhood. Distance, physical distance from with your body, disengagement from your own emotions and your own connection to your internal self, and distortion of story, of narrative, and of truth. And if you think about those practices of oppression and how they relate to our current justice system, we can see that so much of how we practice justice in our country is really rooted in practices of oppression. And so specifically, disconnection from source, so much of how we operate as a culture and as a society, and our awareness of our current criminal legal system is disconnected from the source of that system, which has its roots deeply, deeply embedded in the connection to slavery, to Jim Crow, to the idea that it is okay to commodify human beings. It is rooted in a racist belief that there are distinctions between race that determine somebody's own dignity and value. That's the truth of our roots of our criminal legal system. Yet, as we function and talk about it, we often disconnect our current practices from that source of foundation. Also, many of the practices in our criminal legal system create distance, physical distance for folks that end up snaggled in our criminal legal system. Our confinement conditions, whether it's prisons or jails, oftentimes move people very far from their communities, from their families. It creates physical distance from the people that know and love and care for them, and the people who have experienced harm. The distance that we create is foundational to our criminal legal system. We also disengage from our humanhood. Folks often will tell you, I've worked with many people who have been incarcerated, and they will often tell you that the way that you make it through an experience like being incarcerated is to basically be numb for a certain part of that, right? That they have to really shut off their emotions, shut off their kind of awareness of what's happening to them in order to survive it. And so it is almost a survival mechanism. It is a requirement to make it through many of the processes in our criminal legal system to disengage from your emotions, disengage from your wholeness and your well-being in order to make it through. And finally, and one that a note that I think is really important, especially in the context of restorative justice, is that so much of our current justice system is built on the very foundation of distorting the truth and discouraging truth-telling. So for folks in the US and outside of the US, I think it's a helpful reminder for all of us to recognize that at the very beginning of an engagement with law enforcement or the criminal legal system, we are encouraged and reminded that anything that we say can and will be used against us in a court of law. Right. And so from the very beginning, we are told that we need to be careful about the truth that we tell. We need to be cognizant of how much we share. And when you step inside a courtroom, so much of that experience is about who can create the best story, who can bend and alter the truth of what happened to appease a jury or a judge. And really, it disconnects that story specifically from the people who were involved in a particular incident of harm, with a process of representation where the state becomes the actor that is involved in that harm rather than the people who actually experienced it. And so I say that to say that we have come so far in our country with the belief that justice looks the way that it does, when actually justice really is closely connected to practices of oppression. And I see that I don't have Sia here, but I don't know if anybody else can hit this slide. Okay, great. And so I wanted to then move us into thinking about restorative justice, and how restorative justice allows us to think about justice a little bit differently. Restorative justice is based in practices of liberation. And as you can see, as the comparison across the two, restorative liberatory practices are pretty much the opposite of oppressive tactics and practices. So with restorative justice, we are asking folks to reconnect with the source. Folks are encouraged to dig into their own history, understand the culture and the story that comes with them into a space. When folks are invited into restorative practices, they are invited to bring in their culture with them. And even the structure and design of restorative practices is meant to bring in the practices of one's culture into that space so that they can fully be themselves and connected when they are together. It also is about reclaiming that connection to body, right? Like, many people recognize the connection between restorative justice and mindfulness practices and taking breath. And so what we are encouraging people to do is step back to their connection with their bodies, and be present in their bodies as they come into restorative spaces. We also are asking them to re-engage emotion, right? People who come into restorative spaces are encouraged to bring in the fullness of the emotions that they are experiencing so that everybody can be honest and be aware and be proximate and be a witness to the emotion that has come with the experience when harm happens. And then to reweave the story. I think, as I was saying, this is probably one of the most core dynamics in restorative justice that counters our current approach to justice, which is that story and narrative and truth-telling are the core of restorative practices, and folks are invited to tell their full truth and their full story so that everybody is able to kind of work with the truth of what happened from various perspectives in order to identify the best way forward. And so I just wanted to close this by saying I acknowledge that where we are today feels very distant from where we want to be. And that's not by accident. There are layers of oppression and systems that we have been ingrained in our own understanding of what justice looks like that make it feel very difficult to pivot to something like the notion of restorative justice. But in that pivot lives a pathway to our own liberation. I'm going to ask you to, choose the next slide, Sia. Thank you.
Thanks, Cymone. And so just kind of recognizing that, when we kind of really pick and dig deeply into the different ways that we live in this very punitive and oppressive society, and understanding that can oftentimes feel very hopeless and heavy when you really sit and think with it. And so I think that this is, perfect segue into this RFK quote from the Day of Affirmation address from the Cape Town. This is from 1966, a little while ago, but still so relevant today. And so this quote reads, "Each time a man stands up for an ideal or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope. Those ripples build a current that can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance." Right? And so even though we're all kind of living and working and swimming in this really oppressive society that we've honestly all simply just been handed. And we're kind of just acting out of this cycle that has almost become kind of self-replicating. There are ways to disrupt that cycle, to challenge oppression and stand up against it, and to resist the oppression and really push towards liberation. And so that kind of brings us to the topic of restorative justice, which is really the core topic that we're all coming together to discuss today. And so restorative justice essentially offers us another option. And it's a different way of thinking about what it means to be in community, to live in community, to have relationships with people outside of ourselves. And really also what it means to actively reject this oppressive framework that we've all found ourselves, living in, and that Cymone just described. And so with that, we are going to kind of shift gears a little bit, and to actually begin to talk about restorative justice. And I will hand it back to you, Cymone.
Thanks, Sia. So we've started with a foundation to understand the values, the philosophy of restorative justice that really bring us to the place of kind of our current present day conceptualization of what restorative justice looks like. And so I think before we get into specifics around kind of restorative justice in Western society, what we want to talk about a bit is the cultural and spiritual roots of restorative justice. And those roots, as we've said, and I will continue to say, are really connected to our understanding of relationships and embracing that reality of our interconnectedness. And as Sia mentioned at the opening, this notion of being interconnected and in community is nothing new, right? That's not necessarily unique. It's a framework and a way of being that has existed in every culture around the world for centuries and generations. So if any of us were to go deep enough into our own roots and our own cultural histories, we would find a moment of time, a way of being together that really embraced this interconnectedness. And, I don't know if folks have seen, but a couple years back, there was a story in the New York Times that really lifted up this newfound awareness, at least to the human mind, of the interconnectedness in nature as well, in the root systems of trees and forests, and how even under the grounds of the most vast forests, there is an interweaving of roots that feeds that community, where even trees from different species and size will feed each other the nutrients that they need to survive. And so when one tree is sick, the root system will allow nutrients from another healthy tree to help feed that tree. And when one tree is on its way and dying, it will seed the rest of its nutrients to the rest of the community to keep it going. And so this belief that we are connected to each other lives within our own human connections, but also in the world around us and the beings around us. And so while these practices have existed for many, many centuries and many generations, the term restorative justice may not be what has been used, right? In many indigenous spaces, peacekeeping, those practices are embedded in a holistic worldview where the practice of peacemaking, the practice of being in circle is just a way of life, because the idea of justice is very deeply connected to the idea of healing and restoring balance to yourself, to your relationships, and to the natural world around you. And what's most important is that in these communities, there was no assumption or even a belief that there is an out that you can send people to, right? Because we are in community, the only option when something happens is to call people more deeply in. There wasn't I will send you away to be fixed and then you can come back. It was, you are a part of this community and something has happened. And so as a community, we need to call you back in. And that's a bit different than where we are today and how we handle things. We often think that the solution is to push people away, have them go out, have there be that distance. And so I think that is why the present day understanding of restorative justice has shifted a bit. And many people think of restorative justice as a very specific practice or a tool, oftentimes a program that stands apart from being and living together in a communal fashion. And so even the way that we understand restorative justice today, and we'll talk about it for the rest of the day and in through the rest of the sessions, is disconnected from its original roots and its original practice. It is not supposed to operate as a program and something that is outside of the way that we live together. And so now that we recognize that it has become something of a tool and a program, and in many ways people are using it as a tool and a program to get us back to that original connection of being together. I want to talk a bit about the ways that our program at Impact Justice practices a model of restorative practices called conferencing. Restorative Community Conference is the name of the type of restorative practice that we support communities to develop. And that particular model of restorative justice actually has its roots in both the Indigenous people of the Americas and of the Maori people of Aotearoa, which is now present day New Zealand. And in New Zealand, the Maori people actually helped to develop, based on their own practices and ways of being, a model called restorative family group conferencing, which is a restorative practice that brings young people, their families, both the folks who have been harmed and their loved ones and supporters together when incidents of harm happen from young people. And that has now become the model that is used for young people that cause harm in New Zealand, and it is rooted in the practices of the Maori people there. And in broad strokes, restorative justice, as it is now recognized in Western society, is often traced to Howard Zehr, who put forward a version of restorative justice in Western culture that is a direct comparison to the criminal legal system, to other punitive systems like school discipline approaches, which I'm sure folks are very familiar with here, through a book called Changing Lenses, which came out in the 1980s and has become kind of the foundation for many of the restorative practices that folks are aware of in the United States today. So that's a rooting and a grounding of restorative justice, that as the term restorative justice and how it's kind of evolved. And I'm going to pass over to Sia to talk a bit more about the conception of restorative justice as compared to our criminal legal system.
Thanks, Cymone. So again, and I feel like if there's nothing you take away from today's session, nothing else you take away, it should be at least the reminder and our understanding that restorative justice is not just a tool or a program for addressing harm, right? Again, it's a way of life. And so that being said, restorative justice practices work best when they're first used to build relationships and community and develop a shared understanding. So you see this kind of diagram on the left side of the screen, and if we really kind of adjust that to make it more accurate, more accurately reflect the best and most beneficial way to approach implementing and using restorative justice practices, I can do that, it would look like this, right? And so understanding that the part that takes the most time, but also is the most fruitful, is the community building and laying a foundation where you're beginning to create a practice of being in community, of being intentionally in relationship with folks that you are attempting to be in community with, right? And using restorative justice at the outset to build those relationships so that when harm occurs, there's already a foundational way of being together, some fundamental agreements and values and understanding of how we're going to operate with each other and relate to each other, right? So understanding that conflict is natural and actually can be a positive way of strengthening relationships. And it's not the conflict that's the issue, it's how you respond to conflicts, right? So again, we always advise in the communities that we work with to first really take the time and really invest in using restorative justice approaches to, again, first build community, then moving into creating spaces to address harm when harm occurs within that community that you've already built via restorative justice approaches. And then the kind of final piece of that, once harm occurs, from starting to address harms, the final piece there is then being able to move people towards and create spaces for people to create reparative agreements. So basically agreements or plans to repair that harm to the extent possible, and also move towards healing. And so I think that this diagram or image on the left side of the screen is just really critical and important, because so often you see, especially in the United States, we see schools and criminal legal systems and other institutions really kind of, buying into restorative justice. I think restorative justice is this term that has really grown in popularity over the last couple of years. And so there are so many people who are saying, well, let's do restorative justice. Let's just kind of drop restorative justice into the school or into this criminal legal system, without first really creating the groundwork or building this foundation of, we're actually in community with each other, and we actually have relationships that we've been able to grow and strengthen through restorative approaches. And so again, studies from both domestically and internationally have really found that the best way to go about implementing and instituting restorative justice approaches is by first establishing it more so as a way of life, as we've come to really learn and value that framework and that perspective from Indigenous practices. So all that being said, once you have hopefully really spent the time and invested in taking the space to build relationships within your community using restorative justice approaches, we can then kind of start to shift our focus towards using restorative justice to address harm. And in beginning to kind of think about what that can look like, we often find it helpful to compare restorative justice to our current criminal legal system. And that's really just in large part because so many of us are just unfortunately so familiar with what that system looks like, our criminal legal system, whether because we've been personally involved in it or just from seeing movies or all the television shows that portray our criminal legal system. So we like to say that, and recognizing that this is a gross oversimplification, we essentially like to say that our current criminal legal system essentially asks 3 core questions. And those questions are, what law or rule was broken? Who broke it? And how should they be punished? So again, when our legal system has decided to label crimes, when a quote unquote crime occurs, these are essentially the 3 core questions that our current approach, our current system asks. So in contrast, restorative justice asks a very different set of questions. It asks, who has been harmed? What do they need? And whose obligation is it to meet those needs? So when you see these 2 sets of core questions side by side, who are we focusing on or prioritizing in our current criminal legal system? And feel free to drop those answers in the chat. Who is our current criminal legal system focusing on? Melanie said, prioritizing punishment over restoration, individualism instead of the community. Shazdiel, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, said person causing harm. Absolutely, and thank you for using that person first language. I appreciate you. Person rather than the law. So basically the idea is that our current criminal legal system essentially focuses on the person. It's kind of a little bit of a trick question, but both the person who has caused harm, but also the law, right? And so we have this kind of fictional idea in our country, in the United States, at least, of this idea of committing a harm against the state, right, or a violation against the state, which is why when you look at criminal legal cases, it's always U.S. v. Henry, right? It's never Henry versus the person harmed. It's always the United States or the state of Maryland or what have you, or the Commonwealth of Virginia versus the person who has caused harm. And so there's really no space there even for the actual person who's been harmed in whatever incident we're talking about to be centralized in that process. So I've kind of given away the answer to the next question, but basically in contrast, who are we focusing on in this, given these, looking at these three core questions in restorative justice? Who are we focusing on or centralizing? And again, you can put those answers in the chat. The person who was harmed. Thank you, Monica. Exactly. So it's really shifting that focus, right? And the point here being that when you focus on relationships and people and their lived experiences, as opposed to systems or even kind of quote unquote law and order, or this fictional idea of the state, or even what oftentimes people call public safety, which, you know, is a complicated notion, because that really kind of decentralizes the idea of actual human beings and individuals. When you focus on the people and the relationships harmed in any type of incident, you're really shifting what a system is doing. You're really, you're completely shifting both what a system is doing, but then also the outcomes, because you're shifting the actual focus and the mission and the values of a particular system. And so when you have one system that is really at its core focused on punishment and punitiveness and oppression, and in contrast, you're really focusing more on liberation and also strengthening communities and relationships through restorative justice.
And if I can just add to this slide, while we're talking about the criminal legal system, so much of this is replicated in schools, right? When a young person, a student, breaks a school rule, the focus becomes the rule that they broke and how they should be punished as a result, and not focused on the outcome of whatever behavior or action that happened, right? It doesn't focus on, well, who was harmed or who was impacted by that particular behavior? What does that person or people need? And how can this student be supported to make those things right and make things whole? So I say that to say that even our notion of justice as it's related to the criminal legal system has permeated into other structures in our society, and specifically inside of our schools.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Cymone. So that gets us into what is restorative justice, right? And so again, at its core, restorative justice is first and foremost about relationships and the ways that we create, nurture, and mend them. And so in the context of harm, it's a paradigm shift, right? And so what we're essentially doing is we are shifting from viewing crime as a violation of the law or harm against the state, again, to understanding it to be a violation of people and relationships, and harms against people and relationships that require individual, interpersonal, community, and system-wide accountability and healing. And again, really kind of underscoring this idea that, you know, conflict and even harm doesn't always have to be negative, and even harm can, you know, naturally, as the word implies, be harmful. There are actually ways that you can mend those relationships that actually strengthens peoples and resolves and communities in ways that, you know, can actually both change but also transform the way, you know, people were and the way communities were. You know, maybe you have several people living in a community that originally weren't communicating with each other, were disjointed, and as a result of working through a specific conflict, working through a particular harm, people actually can come out on the other end being more connected and being more aware of their interconnectedness within that community. So this doesn't always have to be a negative thing. And so restorative justice essentially provides a way, and again, a paradigm shift in a different framework and way of viewing and approaching ways that we respond to and address to conflict and harm. So I will hand it back to you, Cymone.
Thanks, Sia. Okay, so with 117 participants, we are going to attempt to do an activity. And because there are 117 of us, this is going to be an individual activity that then has some engagement with the entire group. So what I'm going to do is, again, if you have a piece of paper in front of you, something to write with, if you'd rather use your computer, I'm going to ask you to create a list. And so I'm going to give you a second to get those things situated. Any piece of paper, any pen, obviously we're not in person, so you won't be turning this in, but I will ask people to share. So please have a list available for you to potentially share. And so what I'm going to ask you all to do is to take 1 minute. I'm going to set a timer that you will all be able to hear. And with that first 1 minute, I want you to think about, oftentimes we think about things like new beginnings as an opportunity to do some reflection, right? There are folks at the beginning of the year or New Year's that set resolutions, and in that they take a moment to reflect on the things that they want to work on, what they want to do differently in their coming year. Some people use their birthdays at this, but really think about a time where you have to reflect. And in that reflection, I want you to start by creating a list of the things that you want to work on, things that you might consider your weaknesses. And so I'm going to give you 1 minute on the clock and list as many things as come to mind as the weaknesses you might identify about yourself or the things that you want to work on. So I'm going to start the clock, and 1 minute starts now. Writing down weaknesses or things you want to work on. 30 seconds left, as many as you can think of. We've got 10 seconds. Okay, we are at time. Okay, so pencils down. Many of you educators might be familiar with that. Pencils down. I want everybody to take a look at their list. And if you can, please put into the chat how many things you identified. What are the number of things that you identified on this list of weaknesses or things you want to work on? 5, 4, 2, 5, 4, 4, 3, 1 major one focused. 5, 5, 4, 7. Okay. 2, 4, 5. Okay. 1, 5. Okay. Thank you, everyone. So I want you to now take a moment. We're going to, again, grab those pencils, grab your writing. You can flip the paper over, or you can do it right next to your other list, but I'm going to give you the same amount of time, 1 minute. And I want you to now make a list of the things that you consider your strengths. What are the things that you are good at? And so 1 minute is going onto the clock. Same thing, write as many things as come to mind for you, and starting now. List the things you are good at or things you consider your strengths. About halfway. List as many things as come to mind. Five seconds. All right. We're at time. Okay, pencils down again. And yeah, I would love for folks to take a moment and look at those two lists. And in comparing those two lists, put in the chat which of the lists is longer, which had more things. Second list, strengths, strengths, that's great, strengths, positives, strengths. Second list, first list, second list, strengths. Strengths. Wow, many strengths, okay. The first list, second list, okay. Second list, second list, second list, okay. So I'm seeing, yeah, more, it's looking almost 50-50 that the second list and the first list being the things that you are good at. No, sorry, the first list being the things that you want to work on, the second list being your strengths. Okay, second list, strengths, strengths. Great. Okay. Well, for many people, there's don't you love these kinds of quizzes? There's actually no right answer here. So yay for everyone, 100%. But the point in this is that for many people, and I'm really happy to see that for others, the list of strengths seems to be the longer one of weaknesses. But for many people, when you ask them to spend the same amount of time thinking about their strengths and weaknesses, it is easier to create a longer list of weaknesses or things that people want to work on than it is to create the list of strengths. And for many people, that's because they might live in a society where it is discouraged, like things like humility and trying to not be boastful, make it so folks don't spend much time thinking about their strengths, thinking about the things that they're good at. Sometimes it's because, you know, it is just harder to focus on the things that you're already doing well when we are always encouraged to be more, be better, do more. And so we focus on kind of the things that we want to continue to work on, continue to improve. And so for the second part of this activity, if you have access to your chat and you can directly message me, I would love for one person or a couple people, I guess one person at least, to send me the lists of their weaknesses and their strengths. And I promise I won't say your name, but if you can send me the list that you created, that will be helpful for the next part of this activity. And you can feel free to just directly chat me. I'll give it a second. I'm sure folks are typing those out.
And for folks who don't know, an easy way to directly chat Cymone, there are the three dots. If you hover over the box of Cymone's video, there are the three dots to the top right. And if you click that, then you can hit chat and you can directly chat her.
Thanks, Sia. And I actually have somebody who's come in. So I'm gonna choose this one here. And if there's, you know, I think we only need one example for the purpose of this, but thank you everybody for being so willing to send these lists along. So without naming the name, I'm going to tell you a bit about somebody who just directly messaged me and tell you what I know about them. So this person is really doesn't really care about their students' personality, right? They don't take the time to get to know who they are or what they like or what it is about them that makes them them. They also really have a hard time waking up in the morning, right? They're lazy. They don't really get up, and they're teachers, right? Which is really what you have to do. So they have a hard time getting up in the morning, and you wonder, what should they even be doing teaching? They also really don't know how to create balance in their life. They don't know how to make their space for their own life outside of their work life. And I'm sure that makes them really show up in the classroom in a way that isn't balanced or isn't whole. and they have a hard time managing their time. And so imagine they can't manage their own time. How do they manage the time in their classroom and with others? And so that's what I know about this person, right? And that story of that person is not the whole story of that person. But if I were to only know the things about that person that were their weaknesses, the things that are often identified in a moment where harm occurs about a particular person, then the ideas about what could come next, what could happen, what could be done to restore are very limited to that very narrow understanding of that particular person. But now, because I have spent the time to ask you all what you are good at, what are your strengths, I can tell you a more full story of this person, right? So while this person, doesn't necessarily know everything they want to know or desire to know about the personalities of their students, they understand when the people that talk to them, right? And so they know that they have the ability to connect and have that skill set that they can lean into to better understand the personalities of their students. They are able to take on responsibilities. And so even though they're having some trouble managing work-life balance, they have a strong understanding of responsibilities and how to hold them. And so they can work with that knowing of what it means to take responsibility and applying that to their efforts to try and build more balance in their life. They're very honest. And so they're willing to step into space, being willing to share their full truth, to hear from others and bring all of the complexities of their current being into a space. And they know how to explain a topic, right? And so as a teacher, they might be able to use their ability to explain content and connect on a topic to try and better understand their students and get to know them and really understand the personalities of their students. And so now that I have a list of strengths to also operate on, I was able to speak to all of the potential ways that we can move forward, all of the opportunity that now exists for this person to move forward on the things that they want to work on and recognize the strengths that they're bringing to that space to identify how to move forward. And so I hope that folks can take from that the importance of restorative justice, not just being an opportunity to restore harm and be in community, but it's also a really unique opportunity to start to remind people of their fullness, of their wholeness, of their greatness outside of just a moment of harm. And in doing so, that is where you can identify all of the options available to make things right, that allows people to pull from their strengths and bring that into the space. And so, I'm going to ask you to move us to the next slide.
Yeah, definitely. And but before I move in, I figured it probably makes sense to just kind of describe what these images are that you see up on the screen. So in the top left corner, that's actually in the right, the man in the white shirt. It's a little hard to tell, but that's actually President Barack Obama. And he was sitting in a restorative justice circle with a group of young men of color from Chicago, I believe. And on the right, you have the Dalai Lama sitting in a circle with a group of children passing a talking piece. And then on the bottom, you have one of our old directors of our project also sitting in circle. And I think if you look really closely, one thing that's really beautiful about all of these photos is how if you really pay attention to people's body language, right? And how people are leaning in to really hear and listen to the whoever was speaking in that circle at the time. So really just kind of building off of what Cymone was just saying and really kind of embracing this concept of leaning in literally, both literally and metaphorically, with curiosity and understanding and kind of letting go of all preconceived notions and our own biases and really leaning in to learn and to really see the fullness and the wholeness that is each individual, as opposed to just kind of focusing or pinpointing or underscoring, the negative characteristics or only one or a limited piece of who that person really is.
Thanks, Sia. Okay, and so to underscore this point a bit, I want to tell you all a story. That was actually a story that happened through one of the programs that our previous director of our project, Sujatha Baliga, had the pleasure of being a part of. And so this is the story of a young person who had stolen a car. And the person whose car he stole actually worked for law enforcement and was upset that the damages that were caused through that, when the young person had the car, equated to $3,000, that now this person whose car it was responsible for accounting for. And so in preparing to come into a restorative conference, the first thing that person was thinking about was, I want to get this money back to adjust for the damages of this car. And so coming into that conference, that was kind of the mindset of the person who had been harmed by the act of stealing the car. They brought folks into conference, and when coming to conference, folks are encouraged to bring in the loved ones of that can support them inside of that circle. And so the young person brought his mom, and the person whose car was stolen brought her partner, and they collectively sat in circle. And because circle is designed around and it's oriented around the needs of the person who was harmed, they get the chance to ask some questions to kind of better understand what happened. And so she started to ask questions about the car, about what he was doing, why would he do that? And in that conversation, her partner had a chance to speak in circle. And when her partner spoke, he looked at the boy and he said, "I know you." And as a facilitator of the restorative conference, the facilitator is like, how did I miss this, right? Like, I'm supposed to know the potential relationships that may have existed prior to bringing folks into circle. And then he followed up by saying, "I know you because I was you, right? I resonate with you. I was out there with my friends. We used to get into trouble together." And for him, he had actually experienced being in trouble and being incarcerated for something very similar to what the young man was doing. And so he was able to speak to, I know the pull that your friends can have on you. I know that you have a desire to be with them and kind of stay connected to your friends. Those kids that you steal cars with are your friends, and you can keep them. But in order to move forward and move away from doing stuff like that, you have to start to think about the ways that you engage with your friends. And, you know, this could mean going to the celebrations with your friends, but maybe skipping out on the after party, or being around for certain things and then, you know, having plans that you can't make it to the other things. And so what he was trying to do was resonate with his own experience and offer some suggestions. And in telling him those ideas, he said, so because what you really need to do is figure out, you know, what kind of things can you do with your friends? And then with the other time where you're not going to be with them, when they are wanting to do things like steal cars or get into some trouble, what do you like to do? Like, you have to figure out a little bit more about what you care about. Like, what are you good at? What do you enjoy? And that opened up the young person to say, well, I like art. And even his mom, you know, laughed at that and said, you know, you like art, but that's not going to pay this woman her money, right? Like, you liking art has nothing to do with the idea that you need to get this woman her money back. And actually, the woman whose car was stolen jumped in and said, actually, he can pay me back with his art. Because what I want, and what I've always wanted, is a life-size Tinkerbell. That has to be like the old school version of Tinkerbell. I have so many wonderful memories of Tinkerbell. And I would love it if he could paint it for me in my home. And that became something that, you know, would have never originated having walked into that conference, knowing that her original goal was to get the money. But through this conversation, they identified how a young person could use their interest and their strengths to make things right for this person who had always wanted a life-size Tinkerbell in her house. And so that then became the basis for developing a plan where that young person was connected to some community artists because of the partner that was in that circle, knew folks in the community that were artists and could help train him in how to paint. He was able to get a summer job over the course of months and pay for the supplies to go and actually paint this Tinkerbell for this person. And as you see in the picture here, he actually did paint her this wonderful Tinkerbell that brought her so much joy, and now is something that she can associate with this moment that is going to help her tell a different story about what happened when her car was stolen than what might have been the original narrative she carried forward. And so that is the beauty of restorative justice, in inviting people to bring their strengths, to think about what they're good at, and have that be the turning point for what it means to then make things right and where connections can be formed. And so we offer this story as a highlight of how, some victims might, or some survivors, some people who have experienced harm may still want that money to repair their car, but some of them might just want a Tinkerbell, right? And you have to have a conference that allows the space to walk away with either. So it sounds like in the chat, some folks are really resonating with that story. And so I'm happy that so many folks appreciated the example of that story as a beautiful way that restorative justice can help us move forward. Okay, so I think I am closing before we go to questions with another wonderful metaphor. So one thing that I just want to make sure that we state before we closed our session together today, and before folks kind of walk away with a foundational understanding of what restorative justice is to also name some of the things that I think folks assume with restorative justice that are important to kind of break down. And so in Japanese culture, there is a practice known as kintsugi, which is the art of bringing something together using gold as the bond. And so Sia, if you can bring together this beautiful bowl. And the purpose of that art form is to kind of honor the story of the fractures of a particular piece, right? And having gold be the thing that bonds those pieces back together is an acknowledgement of the beauty that comes from repairing and restoring. And now what once was a bowl that, was shattered to pieces is now this beautiful art piece that can move forward, where the story of the fractures is still remembered and still honored, and the beauty of its coming together is recognized in the gold of that coming together. And while this, for some folks, is the goal of restorative justice, right? Their goal is to, after something has been fractured, bring it back together as it once was. For others, it might be that what they actually decide to do is take the pieces of that fractured relationship and put them together in a beautiful mosaic, where their piece might not be right next to the piece of the person that caused them harm or experienced harm, but they are walking out of that restorative space, recognizing the value that they each have in this shared community, and that they each play an important role in making this mosaic the beautiful mosaic that it is, even if it means their pieces don't come specifically back together. And so the idea of restoration and restorative justice is not about necessarily making things what they once were, but it's about restoring the relationship to self, to community, to family, to the interconnectedness of all of us, and moving forward from there. And so sometimes that looks like a very beautiful bowl with the golden fractures being highlighted through the bond. And sometimes it looks like a beautiful mosaic where each person still has their piece in that picture, and understands that they're both needed to make that picture beautiful. So we're going to close out with that and leave ample time for you all to ask us questions. And I think we are going to, folks may have been putting questions in the chat throughout the duration of this. So we're going to check out the documents that we've been capturing questions for, but also please invite questions at this point. You can send them through chat, and I don't know if you'll be able to unmute for this, but please go ahead and share some questions in the chat.
Yeah, it doesn't look like there have been too many, if any, questions so far. So maybe we can kind of just pause for a second or two if folks have questions or even just like reflections, like what's coming up for you. And also just keeping in mind, I know that a lot of this has been relatively theoretical. So again, just as a reminder, over the next 2 weeks, we're going to be getting more and more into specifics about what this actually can look like in practice, and how you can actually go about implementing restorative justice approaches in your educational spaces, in your classrooms, in your schools generally, and also in your community. So don't worry, we're going to get to all that. We just needed to kind of lay this foundation initially. Okay, so there is a relatively long question here that I will read out. So the question reads, I understand that the outcome of the story you shared is preferable to pressing charges and having that youth come into contact with the criminal justice system. But I worry that it fails to address the roots, the actual material needs that so many people at Steele are facing. I wonder what your take is on the structural violence that allows these kinds of harm to even take place. And also, what does centering the survivor look like when there is a dramatic imbalance of power between the person who stole and the person who has stolen from or caused another kind of harm? I love this question. And this is something that I honestly sit with a lot. So thank you so much. I think it's Jess Steele. I really hope I'm saying her name correctly. Thank you so much for that question. So I'm happy to kind of get us started with this one. So some of you may be familiar with the term transformative justice, right? And there's this kind of, not really a tension, but there are these kind of different camps and approaches and schools of thought where you have restorative justice and transformative justice. And in reality, they're both very much related, and transformative justice very much holds elements and has pieces of restorative justice kind of embedded in it. But the way I like to look at this is that restorative justice is more so focused on addressing the kind of going back to the whole idea of when harm occurs, it creates needs and obligations and needs for interpersonal, community, system-wide accountability and healing, right? So the way I look at it is restorative justice is more geared towards focusing on the interpersonal relationships that are harmed and those interpersonal relationships that are damaged as a result of harm occurring. Whereas transformative justice takes more of a focus, looks more at the kind of more community and society-wide harms and injustices that happen. So you're very right, Justiel, when you point out the fact that oftentimes there are different power imbalances, different financial, socioeconomic imbalances, when oftentimes when harm occurs in our community, especially when you look at the history, our racial justice history in our community, the legacy of slavery, the legacy of indigenous genocide, and all of those harms really all kind of go into contributing to the actual interpersonal harms that occur. And so really in reality, the ideal scenario here is to both have processes that are designed to address both the interpersonal harm that occurs, right? So when someone steals someone else's car and causes thousands of dollars worth of damage, there needs to be a process that addresses that interpersonal harm and creates space for the person who stole the car to take accountability. And accountability and the resulting plan, at least with the programs that Cymone and I work with, the resulting plan being not just about making things right, not just about, this young man making things right to the woman whose car he stole, but also making things right to his family and his community, and also himself. So there needs to be processes both for that to address that interpersonal harm, but also a larger process for that young person's community and then also society within which he's attempting to live and operate and grow up in, to also come to terms with and take accountability for the historical and the intergenerational and ongoing current day harm that has also contributed to the conditions that likely led and also contributed to that young person stealing the car in the first place. So it's hopefully a little bit of slightly satisfying answer, might be a little bit unsatisfying, but basically kind of just in a nutshell, recognizing that the ideal approach here is to both have the create space to address interpersonal harm as well as those larger societal harms.
Mm-hmm. And the only thing I would add to that is that because we are trying to operationalize restorative justice inside of the present day layers of individualism and oppression that we are all kind of existing in now, in some ways, the hope is that even through that interpersonal lens, what people walk away from in that moment is an ability to see each other differently and see others in a different way. And so it may have been like an aha moment for the woman whose car was stolen to recognize that not only can this young person not have $3,000 to support the damages, but neither can their family. Right? That $3,000 is not something that is just available to everybody, right? And that might have been a moment of awakening for them. It may have also been that now this young person is connected to a community of artists inside of their community and has now been connected to a summer job and now knows that they want to pursue this passion of art that might become a modality for them to talk about kind of the things that are going on in their community and the harms that they're seeing in their society. So that's a less concrete thing, but it's part of the ways that restorative justice offers us steps towards the kind of interconnected community that it's originally supposed to be embedded in.
Thanks, Cymone. So we have another question. Is restorative justice suitable for all types of offenses? This is a really excellent question. So there are some kind of core needs or some kind of like core requirements for certain types of harms to be suitable for restorative justice. And they're actually just very basic. The first one is that there be an identifiable survivor, right? So an identifiable person who has been harmed. So, so offenses or types of harm, as we like to call them, like robberies, burglaries, assaults, even all the way up to more serious types of harm, sexual assaults, murders, any type of harm where there's an identifiable person harmed. And also in the case of someone's life being taken, the person's harmed would then essentially be their loved ones. So that's the very first requirement. The second requirement is that the person who's caused harm, or we also like to say that the responsible person, the responsible party, actually be willing to take responsibility for the harm that they've caused. So actually being willing to say, and I think accountability is kind of a big word that we tend to throw around a lot, at least here in the US. We talk a lot about holding someone accountable, right? And there's also just this reality that we actually can't hold anyone accountable but ourselves. And so true accountability is really essentially understanding and acknowledging the harm that you've caused, and ideally making some type of commitment to do your best not to engage in that harm again in the future, right? So it really has nothing to do with punishment. And, unfortunately, accountability too often in our society and our criminal legal system has just been kind of replaced with this idea, this notion of punishment. So again, really the two main requirements there is that there be an identifiable person harmed. So things like a lot of like drug-related offenses, so selling drugs, things like that, where there isn't like a direct identifiable person harmed wouldn't really be appropriate. And again, also you need the person who's actually caused the harm to be willing and able to accept and admit responsibility. And that really goes back to this idea of centering the needs of the survivor of that person harmed. And so you really don't want to bring people together where you have the responsible person continuing to say, I didn't do this, or I only did a little bit of this, or yeah, I did this, but it was actually your fault because I did this. So really having someone, and out the gate, someone might not be there, right? So especially depending on the level of seriousness of the harm or the history and context that led up to that harm occurring, it can sometimes take someone months, if not years, to actually get to a point where they're actually even willing and able to accept responsibility. So we like to say, at least at the Restorative Justice Project, that those are really the only two requirements. And otherwise, it really comes down to, again, centering the needs of the people who are directly impacted by that harm. So this isn't something where you have the state, the federal government, our state government, our local government, saying, these types of harm are okay for restorative justice, but these are just too serious that we actually need to outsource that harm or co-opt that harm or co-opt the process of addressing that harm by, assigning a judge or assigning a prosecutor or assigning a defense attorney, and have these complete strangers who have actually have no stake in this particular harm addressing it. We don't personally believe that any harm really is like too serious that it needs to be outsourced to professionals, so to speak. And actually both domestic and international studies have found that actually the more serious the harm, the more effective and the more beneficial restorative justice approaches are. So it's a great question.
Yeah, I see here one question that came to me directly, which is, does participation in restorative practices lower the community's fear of harm, of crime? And I think that that's a really great question, because that's part of why restorative justice and the way that at least our project thinks about restorative justice is the opportunity for this to be a moment to bring community in, right? So that community can see the transformative power of restorative justice. And with that recognition that they actually have their own tools to be able to address harm when it occurs, it's an empowering feeling to know that we don't actually have to call the police for everything. We don't actually have to go through the criminal legal system, which for many of the communities that are experiencing the highest rates of violence and harm have had very traumatic experiences with the criminal legal system, either through themselves or through their families. And so it's actually a really empowering experience to know that restorative justice is a practice that they can hold without needing to kind of rely on those other systems. And so does it reduce the community's fear of crime? To be honest, I don't know that I can speak to that specifically because it's not something that we've had the honor of studying. I will also note that, and I think this speaks to some question in the chat that I saw about kind of how recent is restorative justice. While restorative justice as just a way of addressing harm and conflict has existed in many communities for many years, as like a form, as an alternative practice to the criminal legal system in this country, in the United States, it's still relatively nascent. It's not something that has had the opportunity to be developed and studied in the way that we would love to like show the very rippling effects of how restorative justice can both support the people who experience harm and the effect that that has on their communities. But it is certainly front of mind for so many of us in the restorative justice community. And I will certainly say anecdotally that the more folks have the opportunity to engage with restorative justice, the better they feel about their notions of safety and the tools that they have to address harm.
Yeah, and kind of just building off of what Cymone was just addressing. So the reality of it is that what we're describing and this what we're calling restorative justice, which is actually really just a modern term that has only been around for about 30 or so years, is really something that we all actually already do already. You all do it already, at the very least with your loved ones, right? With your family and friends, where you hurt someone or someone hurts you. We've all caused harm. We've all been harmed. And oftentimes when we harm someone, what do, right? When it's someone that we care about, when it's someone that's close to us, oftentimes we will apologize. We'll make some type of commitment to make things right if there's an opportunity to do so. And we hopefully, ideally, actually go, fulfill that commitment to make things right, and we move on. And that's really all we're talking about. This is really kind of a basic concept that communities, peoples from all over the world for centuries have been engaging in. We've just kind of slapped this modern day term onto it. And because, especially in the US, and I keep saying that because I know there are folks who are calling in from all over the world, which is beautiful. We unfortunately live in this really individualistic society where we look at harm in a vacuum. And we look at someone who commits a robbery or a burglary or assault or what have you, and we look at that in a vacuum. And we say, this person is a bad person because they committed a robbery. And we don't look at all the factors and all the people and systems that contributed and led to that to that single moment, that single incident. And so it's really, when we're talking about restorative justice, we're really just kind of reminding ourselves of what we already know and kind of inviting folks to return to ourselves and just this kind of natural inherent way of being human and being in relationship with each other.
Thanks, yeah. I have another direct question, which is, does restorative justice put unfair pressure or expectation on the person harmed to speak to those who have harmed them? And I think it's a really great question, and why the model of restorative justice conferencing that our team uses allows for the choice of participation in the actual conference to be completely up to the person who's harmed. And so even if they decide that they're okay with this kind of going to a restorative conference, but they are not yet ready to face with the person who caused them harm, there's alternative routes. They can send a loved one on their behalf. They can, often we call this a surrogate, which is either somebody that they've identified in their life that can come in and kind of speak to the impact of that harm on that person or on that family or on that community. Or they can connect with somebody who has also experienced a very similar type of harm to come in and represent what that kind of harm meant to them. So that the experience of having caused harm, listen to and account for and hear the impact of such a harm is still possible, even if the person who was directly experiencing that harm is not ready to come into that space. So all to say, it's always a choice how the person harmed wants to participate, but restorative conferences and experiences can still move forward, even if that person doesn't want to be the one directly in there. And there's always that opportunity for when they are ready to be invited into that space. Let's see.
So we have another question. So the question is, so is building community resilience against harm or crime one of the aspects of restorative justice? And I think that this is a really great question, as are all of them. So I think that resilience is kind of it's a tricky term, I feel like, in our society. And I feel like oftentimes resilience is applied to historically oppressed communities, right? So oftentimes communities of color, Black and brown communities, and people talk a lot about resilience and the need for resilience and the need to be strong, right? And I think that that's actually not exactly what we're getting at here. So what we're really getting at here is ways of being in relationship with each other that really kind of leads to wholeness and wellness, and kind of takes us back to that original visioning activity that we started off with, where everyone feels like that they belong and everyone has access to the resources and the services that they need to thrive and flourish and to be well and to access wellness. So this isn't so much a process of, supporting communities or individuals and just kind of putting up with harm, right? Or putting up with crime, which is what I tend to hear personally when I hear the term resilience, right? Like, how are you, just kind of powering through and remaining strong, or kind of keeping up your strength in the face of harm? And instead, it's a paradigm shift, and we're shifting from this world, or this kind of, these communities and these relationships that a lot of us honestly have really just inherited, that are really harmful. And it's less so about figuring out ways to just kind of exist or to survive in those harmful relationships, and to actually create entirely new relationships and entirely new communities, which might involve, mending previously damaged relationships, or addressing harm, whether it's historical or current day direct, interpersonal harm, so that we can actually all just be well together.
I have one more question here. The question is, the person who is harmed and the person who have caused harm both need to be in the same frame to restore justice and to value the weaknesses of human. This may not be so easy. Your views, please. Well, I think I think you hit the nail on the head there. It's not easy, which is another thing that I think is a misconception of restorative justice. So many people think that restorative justice alternatives, especially when they think about the criminal legal system, is like the more fluffy version, the easier path, the lighter path. And to be in a place where you can come into owning something that you've done and be in a place to express what has the impact of something that has been done has been on you is really hard. It is a really difficult process to have to go through, and the outcomes of that are so rewarding because of the time and the effort and the energy that folks put into being able to arrive to really talk about what accountability is going to look like. And so I guess to answer your question, to account for and in recognition of the level of time and work that it takes to get people into the kind of space to come into conference together, that's why there is time built in preparation before folks are asked to come into a conference together. There is time, part of the role of a facilitator and loved ones who are going to support a restorative justice space is to figure out where somebody is at, right? How much time, how much work might they need to get them to the point that they can come into conference with the person that they've harmed or the person that caused them harm. And so that might mean like there are some very direct needs that they have right away. Do they need any medical attention? Do they need any housing support? Like, what do they need to be able to come to a state of mind to come into a conference? And so that's my view, is that it is really difficult. And I'm happy that you've made that, because what we're describing here is not an easy thing for people to do. But the more practiced people become in it, the more readily available it becomes for them for future experiences of harm or situations where something doesn't go right. So I hope that answers your questions. It's not easy.
Okay, so I know we only have a couple minutes left, so I'm going to move us on, but this definitely is not the last time we will have last opportunity to take questions. Again, we have 2 more sessions coming up. So with that, I will hand it to Cymone to close us out.
Thanks, Sia. So we wanted to just kind of close out with a few takeaways from today. Hopefully, as you've heard over and over again, you recognize, and why we start here is that restorative justice is not just a program. It's a shift. It's an entire paradigm shift from the way that we understand notions of justice and individualism and how we engage with each other. Restorative justice is a complete pivot from kind of how we know those things to be today. So it's not as easy as just kind of, we want to take a restorative justice program and put it in our school. What we need to be willing to do is step into an assessment of the current context and community that is in the school. And if that is not there, restorative justice can be tools to help build that community before it's then used to address wrongdoing and harm. The other thing that is, we've said over and over again, so hopefully you take this away, is that really restorative justice is about connection and relationships and how we build, how we mend, how we restore relationships with each other. And then what we also hope folks are stepping away with, and will continue to step into the world and into our future sessions with, is just some comfort in the curiosity that you're holding, right? Some of these concepts might be new to folks. Some of these folks might, activate a new spot in their body that they haven't necessarily have activated in conversations about justice before, and step into that, right? The goal of restorative justice is to be curious about another, is to be open to another, and to be open to the questions that folks might have. And so that's something we ask you to take away from this session. And as kind of an opportunity for some home play or reflection and bringing this into your day-to-day lives between now and the next session, we want to invite you to be aware over the next week and pay attention to the interactions and the relationships that you have in your life. And in those relationships, as always, things come up. And when you are in those interactions, what we want you to be trying to take note of is, when does something happen that makes you feel punitive, that makes the reaction that you have one where you want there to be a punitive response? And when are your actions or your reactions restorative? When is the response that you have one that ignites empathy or ignites feelings of wanting to sustain that relationship? When does that come up for you, and with whom in your life does that come up? So we invite you to take those with you today and bring that into our space and time together next week if you're able to join us. I believe this is recorded and will be up for you to share or come back to in the future. And we are so grateful for this time together with you all, and look forward to our next session if you're able to join us on the 27th, where we'll talk a bit more about restorative justice and how it shows up in school community. So thank you so much. This has been wonderful. I really wish we were in space together and we could see all your beautiful faces and speak to you directly, but this has been really nice to spend some time with you all. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
All right. Bye, everyone.